I think that's a very dangerous thing for Bitcoin, and it makes it, at which point it will be worth absolutely nothing. Bitcoin is going to displace a lot of things because I think there's going to be some countries, big countries that fail. I think this idea that there will be $1 million Bitcoin, I tend to agree with that. Probably going to be, by this time next year. But 15 to 20 years, I think Bitcoin will be 50% of the world's total addressable market.
Mr. Ian Northon, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a lot of fun for me. Really enjoy talking with you.
So for those that don't know, Ian is the co-founder and chief legal officer for Ocean Mining. And we have not had really a ton of people in this space that are knowledgeable about the mining space on the podcast. We on the pod here, we try to do a lot of reaching to the masses and trying to keep things at a level where the average person can understand what's going on. Because quite frankly, as you know, especially being in the legal world or all the jargon, the Bitcoin world, legal world, it's hard for the average person to really comprehend what's going on a lot of times. So I want to start right there, actually. Where does this intersection of Bitcoin and a lot of society, it's changing a lot. I mean, there's the saying of Max Kaiser, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. And, I look at insurance being changed, and, it's for someone who maybe a small policy you might have, but long-term, you kind of look at Bitcoin as, hey, that is my insurance policy. Or, just someone with, an estate plan, or they're looking at trust. I mean, there's a lot of people that I'm sure you've talked to as well that like, well, I've got Bitcoin and I don't need it in a trust because of X, Y, and Z. I have the seed phrase in my head, or my family has the, good luck state getting my hands on it. So with all that being said, how have you seen Bitcoin start to change, and how, or even how will change the future going forward in a lot of these different industries that are starting to get disrupted by it?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. You raised a lot of different things there, but I think you're right. I mean, seeing this play out in real time is a lot of fun for me. I mean, I got into Bitcoin, late compared to some of my co-founders. I mean, Luke Dasher's been in Bitcoin since late 2010. I didn't come to it till a little bit later, and then, my wife used to tease me. She used to call it monopoly money, right? But kids were using it on video games, and it was just kind of a thing unto itself. But now, as you said, you're seeing, big companies, big corporations, all kind of like look at it and adopt it, but you're also seeing it on the retail side. And it's been fun for me to watch that. But, when you're talking about Bitcoin, you're really talking about, some people have called it revolutionary money or freedom money, or they talk about it in these broad brushstrokes. And so it's really got, these kind of underpinnings of history and philosophy and all these things behind it. And so it's not surprising to me now, 10 years later, 15 years later, to see it doing what it's doing, because everyone who looks at something like insurance, what's insurance? It's like a hedge against the future. You're trying to protect yourself against some catastrophic risk, right? Well, one of the catastrophic risks that people don't like talking about it is their money or their savings going to zero, or something terrible happening and they can't replace something, and if you're in the insurance business, people talk about the replacement value or something. Well, if your dollar is going down, then your replacement value becomes almost impossible, because I insured a car at 50 grand and all of a sudden 3-4 years later it's worth 10 grand and it gets wrecked. To me, it's worth 50 grand because that's what it's going to cost to replace it. And if the insurance is denominated in dollars, they'll maybe give you 8 grand for it, right? Like you're losing. But if it's denominated in Bitcoin, all of a sudden that's kept up or done well. Now you can replace it. And these are the types of things that when you've got sound money or good money behind something, Bitcoin is going to displace a lot of things, because, their assets are going to seed, they're going to zero. And, and so I think I'm not surprised. I did, when I was a brand new lawyer, I did a lot of pension disputes. All these pension plans for all these big companies in Detroit is where I got my start. They were all underfunded and they couldn't pay. And so companies were trying to get creative by getting rid of them and moving people to different platforms and getting rid of the defined benefits and moving to defined contributions and all these controversies. And then you saw all these problems with it. But if they had a slice of Bitcoin, all those underwater pension plans would be doing just fine, right? And you're seeing now even large institutional investors that are responsible for saving for somebody else say, where can I put Where can I put sound money, or what investments can I have when the world is seeing bombs dropped by these ancient nations against each other, in Israel and Iran and all these kind of controversies
Mhm.
around the world, all these things. And Bitcoin is that safe haven. So I'm not surprised. I think you're going to see more and more. And what do they say? Slow then fast, right? It's gonna speed up.
Is there stuff in the legal world or anything that you can see where Bitcoin is maybe not disrupting it yet? Because again, I think we're still really early, but were there areas where, whether it is like the trust or things like that, where people are going to have this outside of this legacy system we're in? Do you foresee stuff like that where it's really Bitcoin will really start changing some of the legal frameworks, or some of what we've just seen, I guess, throughout history?
Well, starting, I think it was maybe 2014, the IRS kind of finally got around to trying to define what Bitcoin was, and
Hmm.
they didn't come up with a great solution, but they called it property. They kind of defined it just like any other piece of property, and in some ways, that very simple response is actually a pretty good one. And so it jams up a lot of people because there's capital gains when you buy it and sell it and do different things like that. But when you think about it, it really is. It's a property. It's a digital property or digital asset. But you know, the IRS's take on it in 2014. I mean, that's now, what is that, 11 years old? I mean, that was kind of right. And
Yeah.
so when you see a trust, what's a trust trying to do? A trust is trying to protect assets for the future. And so, I'm not surprised that Bitcoin is getting into more and more trust, more and more people that have been exposed to Bitcoin over the years at different ages. You know, this is the kind of thing that generations have to plan for. So if you got into Bitcoin as a kid, well, now, you're an adult. Now you have a family to look after. If you got into Bitcoin as an adult and now you're starting to get a little older, I've got some gray hairs under this hat. It's one of those things that you're starting to say, all right, what can I do for my future? What can I do for my family? That's what trusts are designed for. And so I've seen a lot of mistakes in that area, right? Like people have these great plans, and you hear all the time about people, dying without an estate plan, and now it's going to
Hmm.
court for some court to sort out. Well, the courts aren't very well equipped to deal with strange things like Bitcoin, right? They don't understand it. They don't
Right.
understand how wallets work, or what a seed phrase is. So if you put those things in your trust, and or figure out a way to make sure your heirs and those that come after you can access these funds after you die, you know this is good advice for anybody, old or young, right? I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. I could slip in the shower. Anything could happen, right? So I'm not surprised that as Bitcoin becomes more and more well adopted, that more and more people are looking to these traditional ways of protecting assets to also protect their Bitcoin. Because for many, it's their most important asset. So I'm not surprised by it. And then you're starting to see service providers stand up around that, whether they're financial advisors or money guys
Hmm.
or attorneys, and I've had, any number of calls where an estate planning attorney or a divorce attorney calls me and says, hey, you've been talking about Bitcoin for ages. I don't do any divorce work. I don't do any divorce law, but somebody comes to me and says, hey, we're suing, this former spouse, and they're hiding assets in Bitcoin or whatever. What do we deal with it? I
Mm.
said, well, you deal with it. It's an asset. You have to tackle it with all the ways that you normally would. Or I gave a talk years ago. I'm trying to remember when now, but during COVID, like 2021, trying to remember back exactly, up at Mackinac Island. It's like an island. If for the people who aren't familiar with Michigan, it's beautiful in the summertime. There are no cars there. You have to take a ferry to go get there. And it was all the federal judges in like the Midwest were talking about bankruptcy and other challenges with the federal courts. And they asked me to come give a talk on Bitcoin. And some had never heard of it. Some had heard of it, but not ever dealt with it. And others were starting to see it pop up in their court cases. Somebody declares bankruptcy, some company, some individual, and they've got Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Like, what do we do with it? I'm like, it's important. It's a real asset. Like, don't just like, gloss over the order. Like, get it in the right spot, get it in the right buckets, use it to pay back credit, whatever. There's hundreds of years of laws that lead up to this point. Just because Bitcoin is relatively new doesn't mean you have to lose your mind and forget all the things that we've learned up until this point, right? I deal with that with fraud cases all the time. People have been stealing or defrauding folks in every way imaginable over time, and pensions are no exception to that. Well, Bitcoin came into the mix. Well, people are now defrauding people over Bitcoin. Well, be on guard. Like, but there are still tools and different things that the courts. You don't need to necessarily understand what was taken. You just have to understand that it was taken and how it was taken, and you go and prove your case the normal way. So I've been given a fair amount of advice to other specialty lawyers in other categories. I've never really been a specialist. I've always been a trial attorney, so kind of a generalist. So I would take those disputes to trial, but you had to learn about everything underneath that, and learning about Bitcoin along the way was something that really gave me an advantage. But it was something I was already interested in, so it was natural that it would kind of bleed over into my legal practice.
That's fascinating. I would definitely touch on that in a minute, and just, why Bitcoin, and why you gravitated to it. For an older person, we have a lot of people. I mean, I would say the majority of the people that watch this show are probably 35, 40 to 65 years old, and they tend to be men. 9 out of 10 of them are men. And then vast majority of those at that are 35 or 40 to 65 years old. So how should someone, we believe that in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I mean, someone's stacking Bitcoin right now, they're going to have a lot of wealth, a lot of purchasing power. But then you have like that Bitcoiner ethos, and you kind of touched on this of, well, hey, again, I'm outside the system. Like you said, people are getting sued, and it's like, hey, you don't know how much Bitcoin I have, or it's, I've got a seed phrase, I got it in my head, you have no idea, and someone just takes off. Like how should someone be thinking about that? Because I know I see the comments that we get here, and people are, hey, I'm older, how should I be thinking about this? Is Bitcoin in an estate plan? Like, how should people be thinking about this? Is it outside? Like, how does a lawyer go after? How does the legal system go after someone that has Bitcoin when you don't know how much they have, or and it's in their head, really the seed phrase, or it's on a cold storage wallet? Like, how should the average person be thinking about it, and how does the legal system kind of look at all that?
Well, I think the best advice you can give is for people is to not get into those situations, right? So it's a lot easier to deal with a fraud by not getting defrauded in the first place. So, if something's too good to be true, it probably is, right? And so, the wisdom that your grandmother gave you, who had never heard about Bitcoin, is the same advice that you would give now: is to not get into those situations in the first place. Once you're in them, they become very difficult to fix or sort out. But you're right. I mean, look, there are situations where if you're dealing with a bad actor, and that bad actor is sophisticated, and Bitcoin in some ways makes it easier to move money around, or move money around in nefarious ways. But the reality is that it's a public ledger. And so, when you've got a public ledger, Bitcoin is not in that sense secret. It's not
Mm-hmm.
private. People talk about private keys, but that's really just the ability to spend what's on the ledger. And,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of proves, like a bearer bond, you own it or have possession or control over it. And so you have to deal with it like other things like that. And it's hard sometimes, but you'd be surprised what somebody will do if they're being, faced with criminal prosecution, how quickly they might
Mm-hmm.
give up a seed phrase if it means shaving,
That's a
you
good
know,
point.
10 or 20
Yeah.
years off of a criminal sentence, right? Now, in the civil cases that I litigate, they're over money. And so, dealing with bad actors who hide and evade, and there are ways, and the courts have always had ways to deal with bad actors like that. And, court orders,
Mm-hmm.
forcing somebody to come in and disclose if you don't disclose accurately and you can prove it. You use the same tried and true techniques that you've used in any number of other things, and it translates pretty well to trying to solve the problems that people deal with Bitcoin. But from a planning standpoint, if you had something valuable hidden that no one knew where it was or how to get at it, how good is that, or how useful is that? And so you have to surround yourself with people you trust. Some people can trust their kids, others can't. Some people
Mm-hmm.
can trust their spouse, others
Very point.
can't. I'm very fortunate. I've got 5 wonderful kids and a wife, and I trust all of them. And so I try to teach them, or get them exposed in small ways. So, and I'll tell a quick little story, but my son, he's in college now, getting ready he's got a year left, and he's looking at medical school. He's a really smart kid. He's hardworking. But when he was doing summer jobs, mowing lawns and working at the golf course and waiting tables and different things, he would come to me and say, "Hey, Dad, I finally got some money. I've been working. What do I do with it?" And I helped him save it in Bitcoin. And now scroll forward 5 years, he comes to me and he says, "Hey, Dad, I want to get married." And he gets ready to get engaged, and he said, "I've got some of this Bitcoin saved up. I wanna spend some of it to buy an engagement ring." And I said,
Wow.
"Son, he was concerned because I've been trying to drill into his head. You don't waste your Bitcoin, right? You don't. Some people will say spend fiat, save Bitcoin, and there's
Hmm.
a limit to that, right? I
Yep.
get I get the concept. It's a pretty good catchphrase, but you
Yep.
got to live your life too. So I said, look, don't
Hmm.
waste your Bitcoin. Like I don't want you spending it on
Right.
at the bar. Maybe I'm not going to waste it at Steak and Shake. I love Steak and
Yeah.
Shake, but
Yeah.
I might try it out a little bit, but don't
Yep.
spend your stack. Don't buy a shake every day or 10 times a day, right? Like, but buying something like permanent, like he's getting married. I'm a
Yep.
Catholic. I want that to be permanent. It's forever. Buy an
Yep.
engagement ring. Absolutely spend your Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Don't spend all of it. Save a little bit, right? Don't.
Yep.
But he went out and bought a beautiful engagement ring. They're engaged. They're going to get married next year. Like I'm so excited for him.
It's
But it
amazing.
was kind of a permanent thing. It was like and then he
Hmm.
saved a little bit
Perfect
more.
trade.
So when
Hmm.
he's in a spot to maybe buy that first house or put a down payment down, he's got a little bit more Bitcoin. And this is an example where I don't mind you know explaining it to him and he picked up on it and he's taken that to heart. Now some of the other kids it's taken them a little longer and but those are conversations you should be having. And if they don't have a wallet that they're playing around with or learning how to do it and then you're probably doing them a disservice, right? Like people don't write checks anymore, but my parents sat me down
Hmm.
when I was a kid and said, this is how you write a check, put in the amount,
Yeah.
who's it going to, sign it. When you get a check, this is how you deposit it. Like those are things that, those little financial management tools, like you should just sit down and send some sats back and forth to your kids, to your family members. And, people complain all the time that they're having a hard time orange pilling those close to them. And I get it. I've been talking about Bitcoin. People get annoyed with it. All the memes are out there, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, if you sit down and show somebody how to do it, or send them a few Sats, like all those early conferences back in the day, you'd go and they'd send you some Sats, or they'd print it off on a piece of paper and say, "Here, download this or do that." That was a way to just start to learn. And the more you learn, then you'll be hooked, right? It doesn't. Everyone's got this like pain tolerance or threshold and they always kind of move toward the convenience. But it's like, why would I swipe that credit card and pay interest on it if I've got something better behind it, right? And so that's why I think you're going to start to see more and more, back to your earlier question or point, is more and more financial things are going to move into Bitcoin instead of selling the Bitcoin. They might leverage it to buy a house, or they'll take out a Bitcoin loan in order to invest in themselves or their business or something like that. I think you're going to see more in that. I'm never a big fan of debt or encouraging people to borrow, but at the same time, unless you're part of the landed elite or just sitting on a stack of
Hmm.
cash and people have to figure ways out to do it. And so I think you're going to see more and more of that as we move forward. But be careful. Don't get over leveraged. Don't get over collateralized. Always read the fine print. It's there to snake bite you. That's as the lawyer, that's what I would be warning people or telling people to make sure you're staying within what you understand. And if you don't understand something, ask around until you do. I mean, people always tell you if you've got money and you go to invest, never invest in something you don't understand. Well, that gets a little tricky with Bitcoin. Like, not too many people that you talk to understand Bitcoin mining or how Bitcoin transactions actually work or what SHA-256 encryption is or something like that. But as you start to unpack it, most people don't understand what happens when you swipe a credit card or when you mail a check or different
Right.
things. They just understand that's kind of the part that they have to handle. But that user stuff, the way you interact with an exchange or the way you interact with a wallet or encouraging people to set up their own node. It's starting to be so easy to do that. Set up a node and understand how to broadcast a transaction and pay somebody peer to peer. I mean, that's what Bitcoin was really designed for. And that's why I feel pretty fortunate having come to Bitcoin the slow way or the long way in through mining is those basics are there. And the more and more people that get exposed to Bitcoin on the retail side, the less and less or the fewer and fewer actually understand some of that back and forth. And so the more we can do just when we get a chance to talk about it to encourage those kind of good sanitary behaviors and good behaviors of running your own node and understanding privacy a little bit. Again, it's a public ledger, but there are things you can do, to make you a little bit more resilient to to some of these other external pressures.
There's so many things. You touched on a few things that we're going to talk about in a little bit, and some others to chew on. Do you think there's the first thing I want to hit though is the, like you said, the retail side? Do you have hope though that people come in? I always think of, because we're battling like the Bitcoin cypherpunk ethos and also this mass adoption world. Like, to your point, like most people don't even know what the fiat system is. They have no clue, couldn't tell you a thing about the fiat system. It's probably about 90-95% people at least can't even explain to you that. So are we in a world where people are ever going to get Bitcoin? And I'm working on a book, and Bitcoin and the American Revolution, around that small book, but I'm kind of convinced that it's going to be 3% of people, and like we're all going to drag everyone across the finish line, and you kind of got to get the orange pill Trojan horse into the gate somehow. Where are you on like the retail side? Because I'm very empathetic to both sides, and I lean more on the side of the cypherpunk ethos, and at the same time I'm trying to understand myself of like, well, we got to get the Trojan horse inside the gate somehow, and while also educating people, like you said. So like, where do you have great hope for the retail side? Like, hey, the more people that are in their IRA or whatever it is, although it's not self custody, it's not node running, they're going to learn about it more over time. Like, to me, this is the struggle of our time in a way. This is like the battle, the information war that we're all in right now, trying to like marry these sides together of like the couple percent of us versus, really, and I shouldn't say versus, but trying to get everyone else. Like, where do you kind of stand on all of that?
Well, I was a conservative and a libertarian thinker,
Mm-hmm.
and I was at a large law firm in Pittsburgh during the financial crisis in '07, '08. And it was interesting. My old firm represented, I think at the time, like 30 of the 35 world's largest banks. And then I checked in on them a couple years later. I had moved on and taken another position, and I saw that it had gone down to like 20 of the 23 largest in the world or something. And I talked to one of the guys. I said, are things going crazy there? Like, what's happening? And he said, oh, we didn't lose any clients. All these big banks through all the financial crisis just merged. They just bought and sold other banks, and the big ones got bigger and the little ones disappeared. And that was right as Bitcoin was becoming a thing. And so when Bitcoin got started, and I started first learning about it. And you look at, the reason for it. Why does this exist? It exists to resist all of those kind of trends financially, right? These financial pressures. And so if Bitcoin loses its peer-to-peer concepts, if it loses its node running concepts, I think that's a very dangerous thing for Bitcoin, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes it kind of a target for capture. Anything of value is going to have a big target on its back. And the people who have been predatory for generations will see Bitcoin as an opportunity to be predatory again. And so I'm very loath to recommend to people that they go that easy route, so to speak, in order to get exposure to Bitcoin. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, is exposure to Bitcoin better than nothing? It depends.
Mm-hmm.
It is if you're dealing with safe counterparties, and but the whole goal of Bitcoin, or the nice thing about Bitcoin, was it was trustless. You didn't have to trust the person on the other side of the deal. You could trust the math and the algorithm and self custody to protect you against bad actors. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but to whom much is given, much is expected. And the level of responsibility goes way up if you're dealing with Bitcoin or dealing with self custody, or even if you use multi sig and other things. The risk goes way up. But what risk are you trading it for? Counterparty risk. Banks go belly up, exchanges go belly up, all these counterparties go belly up. That's going to continue to happen, and there's going to be a lot of pressure in that space, and I think you're going to see more of that. So I hope that people don't get burned. But this was the Sam Bankman-Fried FTX argument. Oh, let's make it easy for
Yep.
people, and it was all smoke and mirrors, and there was nothing real behind it. I mean, this guy was not a Bitcoiner. He showed up, Johnny
Right.
come lately. Nobody in the Bitcoin community knew this guy. Anybody that peeled back the onion a couple of times knew this guy was a scammer. And yet it brought a lot of people to Bitcoin, who then ended up in litigation because they're waiting for their payouts because they got defrauded and scammed. So again, I don't want to sacrifice those kind of core principles, those that libertarian cypherpunk ethos, that anti-government, so to speak. I love the United States, but I don't love
Hmm.
everything that it does, right? So, you mentioned Bitcoin revolution. I think the American Revolution was fought over like excise and stamp taxes of about 2 or 3%.
Yep.
And
Yep.
for 2 or 3%, people were willing to fight life and liberty and go to the mat for it. And, you know, our culture is not like that anymore. They're happy to be taxed 30, 40, 50%, 60% in some cases if you have a business. And they're just like they go with the flow because they think, well, if I can game the regulatory system a little bit better, then I'll just be a little better than the next guy and can still exploit. And I think there's a lot of people in the space that talk about those rent seekers and those predatory tactics, and I think they're right. So I would caution against that, but at the same time, if it's temporary, right? Uh, go get some Bitcoin on an exchange and then get it off. Figure out how to do that. I'm okay with that. But there's definitely some trade-offs, and again, what risk are you really controlling for? Is it counterparty risk or risk that you lose your seed phrase? Is it counterparty risk or is it risk that you screw something up or send Bitcoin to the wrong place and it's gone, right? So you just have to understand as you navigate the world as a person of responsibility, and you're responsible for your own choices, and you have to really kind of give yourself some tough love and say, am I up for it? And if you're not, then maybe you have to train yourself so that you will be. And that applies to a lot of areas of life, right? So if you have the discipline to be able to do it, then I want you to do it. And the more Bitcoiners there are, the merrier. If you don't have the discipline to do it, then Bitcoin's not going to be like a silver bullet. It's not going to save you because you're going to,
Yeah.
you don't have control over your own life. How are you going to get control over your own money? So it's a challenge.
Yeah, and it really is a personal development world that you're in, right? And you and I have some things in common, like the sports world growing up, playing professionally, and it's like a lot of that is personal development, right? And you in baseball and I in hockey, and it's you're trying to get better every single day, but it's like you said, if you don't have that, or you're not trying to seek something different or get better, then you're going to squander it, whatever it is. Do you think that like the ETFs, because this was the next question, and I'm going to kind of marry them together a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about lending. Obviously, you have the Bitcoin Treasury companies. You've got a lot of the lending stuff at Jack Mahler's with Strike, and this is now starting to speed up. I was talking to Joe Consorti about Thea, and then CJ Constantinos, the People's Reserve, the Bitcoin mortgage products, and like all these things that are coming out. And we have some of those interviews dropping as well here with, and I've talked to those guys. What are your thoughts with the ETFs and the lending, like all these different things that are happening? Do you think this will be a net good in the long run, or do you think it's gonna, like where do you, when you look out on the horizon here, is this something where we are losing the ethos and it could really spin off the rails over time here, or is it going to be a net good?
Well, we'll see. I mean, look, financial creativity is not new. People
Hmm.
have been trying to figure out ways to move money and move goods and services, and money's really just a proxy for your work, right? And
Yep.
so, but to the extent you're tied to an old way or an old system, yeah, I think these new or innovative products
Hmm.
might be a good thing, but you always have to be careful. I mean, look, Jesus chased the money lenders out of the temple, right? Like with a whip. Like
Right.
this is the most aggressive Jesus,
That we
historical
know.
account
Yeah.
was he was chasing them out, right? And and there was a reason why he was killed shortly thereafter. And so, like, you're going to take some hits. You're going to take some hits if you're way into this space. Now, does that mean every lending product is bad? No, but there will be some dogs out there that I
Hmm.
would tell people to avoid like the plague. There might be some better ones, but the nice thing is that people will need to borrow money. Um, I think that's a pretty common thing in the human experience. If you're trying to, you're trading your future self. You're trying to figure out a way. You've got a plan or an idea or a way to jumpstart that, and you need capital to do it. And if you don't have the resources to either generate it yourself or get it from friends and family, then borrowing against your future is a risky play, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. I borrowed money to get my first house, right? I didn't have the ability to pay cash for a house, so I got a mortgage. And these things are not terribly uncommon. I think most people understand them a little bit, but most people don't understand them very well. So again, before I tell somebody to get a Bitcoin loan, to buy a house, I would say, well, you know why would you do any loan, right? Like you have to like fundamentally, what are you trying to accomplish? And if it's like, well, I want a safe
Yeah. What's
place
the end
for
goal?
my wife and kids, then am I willing to trade some of that risk for that long term security? And I
Hmm.
think that, yeah, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. But the folks that are borrowing against their Bitcoin to buy more Bitcoin, and then they keep leveraging it and cycling it, that's a creative play. Like they're trying, but I'm kind of, I take the long view, and I'm more of a, reduced leverage guy, and I don't like to see those kind of high risk plays. I think you're better off saving your Bitcoin and trying to find ways to stack it more creatively. Add value instead of just trying to arbitrage in between. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't real things in there, but again, I don't encourage people to try things that they don't understand because the risks go up. And if you don't
Hmm.
understand the risks, those are the ones that sucker punch you. Those are the ones that sneak up on you.
The old blindside.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, um, what are you? It's a great segue. In a minute, I want to circle back to the pension disputes and what you were doing there that we were kind of talking about on the top. But I want your thoughts on Saylor because we're kind of talking about this whole thing. Speaking of someone who raising money and doing all this, but I would love your thoughts on Saylor, what he's doing, and again, some of these Bitcoin Treasury companies. Obviously, a little different, just for someone listening, a little different than the lending side and what we were just talking about, obviously, and someone trying to arbitrage things or whatever it is, or tap equity that they might have in legacy assets or whatever it is. But I would love your thoughts on Saylor, what he's doing. And, he just obviously recently came out with his, updated, hey, it's going to be 13 million. Well, now it's 21 million and it's 21, 21, and 21. I figure Bitcoiners are great at memes and
Yep.
we're trying to will things into existence. I kind of look at just the Overton window, you're trying to move the Overton window. That's kind of a lot of how I take it to a degree. Doesn't mean he's wrong or right. He might be above or below the target and what it actually ends up being. But I would love just your thoughts in general on him and strategy and what you see in that world as you kind of look out across the treasury, the Bitcoin treasury landscape.
Yeah. So, to me, I don't like to just, opine, on things I don't know. I'm not a sophisticated corporate lawyer. I wasn't in big finance or high finance. I dealt with disputes. And so, I see this as when Saylor came out initially and said, "Hey, I've got this really profitable software company and we've got all this cash sitting around. And right now our cash is losing value. Inflation is just rocking, 5, 10, 15% a year. He's got all this cash on his balance sheet that's just sitting there becoming less valuable. It made a lot of sense to me for him to put his cash into Bitcoin. That made a lot of sense, and it's something that I've advised some companies to do. It's something that Ocean does. We don't let our cash just sit. We want to make sure that it's not losing value. We've got to so we have a bit of a Bitcoin treasury ourselves. So that's something that makes a lot of sense to me. It's a pretty straightforward proposition. If I've got cash sitting around, why would I let it lose value when I can put it in some reasonable thing like and to Bitcoin, there's you could put it in some CD with a bank or something,
Mm-hmm.
but to me, there's nothing better than Bitcoin. So why wouldn't you put that extra cash in Bitcoin, and then just spend what you have to? But that's not what he's doing now. I mean, when he started selling equity, diluting his existing shareholders to buy more Bitcoin, and then selling these financial products where he's basically giving a loan and saying, well, I can pay back the loan, or I can give you equity and I'm going to use it to buy Bitcoin. That starts to get pretty creative. And again, I don't want to comment on things I don't understand well, but it starts to add risk in ways that are pretty shocking in some ways, right? And so he's been a great advocate for Bitcoin, and I get that. And so I want to tip my cap to his general advocacy for Bitcoin. But the trend we're seeing with his own company now, leveraging, and he's got new stock tickers for each of his new kind of more exotic products, starts to get pretty interesting to me. And I can see on the one hand, if it works, good for him. He's a financial genius. On the other hand, if it doesn't work, he'll be in bankruptcy again, right? It wouldn't be the first time. And so, if memory serves, so these are the challenges that you face. Now, we were both at the big Bitcoin conference down in Las Vegas, and I sat in on a legal discussion about Bitcoin Treasury companies. And, these kind of ghost companies that are public companies, they're out there, they're sitting, they don't really have any real products. They're just sitting there. Somebody formed them, or maybe they've got some money that they went out and raised from investors, and it's just sitting there. It's kind of, and so they're trying to put some juice into it, and they're saying, well, we'll go become a Bitcoin company. We'll go take the money we raised and buy Bitcoin with it, and now all of a sudden our balance sheet will be great. That's interesting, but the reality is but they're not adding any value. They're just trying to take something of no value, their company, and make it more valuable by owning Bitcoin. Now, people who are honest about that, who form a company for the sole purpose of buying Bitcoin, that seems to be a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more honest to me. But using these ghosts or these shells or these fake companies to try and
Hmm.
salvage them just because they happen to be pre-approved or have a regulatory path. I mean, it's that seems to me short-lived. It may work for some of them, but taking a company that makes some completely unrelated widget and saying, well, now it's a Bitcoin company, so now it's more valuable. Maybe it'll juice it up, but are you making good widgets? Like why does the thing even exist? And so, if I were an investor looking at something like that and I had money to spare, I probably wouldn't throw it at one of these companies. You're trusting the very operators who didn't do a good job of operating their company, and to then hold your Bitcoin or buy Bitcoin with it so that you get a piece of the action. Why not just go buy Bitcoin yourself or find
Right.
somebody that you can, so again, to me, it's who are the counterparties? Who are you trusting? Like, and I get it. A lot of people they don't think they have the time or the patience to understand Bitcoin, but I promise you, Bitcoin is a lot easier to understand than this 40-page prospectus with that says, if this does this, then this happens, and if this does that, then this happens. I mean, run one of those agreements through an AI, and it'll just have like red flag, red flag, red flag. Why not just go the direct route? So again, it'll be interesting to see. But to me, if rather than invest in a Michael Saylor subsidiary or a Michael Saylor company, I would just buy Bitcoin. And again, people are like, well, I get more juice, I get more leverage, I get more this, I get more that. And it's like, yeah. And every one of those extras comes at a risk. And to me, unless you're adding value, it gets back to that personal responsibility. Are you providing a good or a service? Are you providing some value? If you're not, then, you know, I would just buy Bitcoin, you know? So again, I don't want to be too critical but at the same time, I'm just it always raises a lot of red flags when somebody is doing things with leverage, and again, early on, taking extra cash, putting it in Bitcoin, it made good sense. He was being a good steward of other people's money or his company's money. I get it, but when you start taking big bets, you get better odds sometimes at the casino, and I would just say, eh, Bitcoin casino or Bitcoin. I'd rather go with Bitcoin. So is
Hold on 1 second. If you are holding your Bitcoin on an exchange still or sharing your keys and your KYC information with a third party, everything you're learning about right now is completely moot. This is your wake-up call. You are only self-sovereign if you alone hold the keys to your wealth. Bitcoin is the first and only asset in human history where humans can actually custody entirely their asset. Custody sounds daunting at first, and believe me, it was for me 10 years ago, and I missed a year or two of massive gains, and I don't want that to be you. It's exactly why you need to talk to my friends, Tony Asback and the Bitcoin Way. His team will train you to do it right the first time. We just interviewed Tony the other day, has 50,000 views, an unbelievable response. People love him and his story and what he has to share and his mission. Head on over to thebitcoinway.com/Brandon to schedule a free 30-minute consultation today. Their 5-star rated service is exactly what you need. So quit sitting on your hands like I did a decade ago and get started today. Now that you have the team that's going to help you store your generational forever, you need the tools. Do not store your generational wealth on paper. Store it on titanium. My friends at Stampseed have the professional tools you need to sleep soundly at night. It's estimated that 30% of Bitcoin will be lost forever. That's only going to increase. Don't be a statistic. Use promo code Brandon for 15% off store-wide. BRANDON, Brandon at checkout for 15% store-wide, so you can sleep soundly at night knowing your generational wealth is protected forever. Now back to the show. Yeah, and that really is the beauty of Bitcoin too. And who knows? The average person, I'm guessing, is not in strategy, but who knows which way it goes, right? Like they keep getting bigger and they start taking over more of what's going on, and then you have more people centralized into that. And the beauty of Bitcoin, to all of what you're saying, is the average person can work as a lawyer, a doctor, or they can work at McDonald's. And if they save more than they spend and just have earn in Bitcoin or save in Bitcoin, they can get wealthier over time. And that's the ease and the simplicity of Bitcoin. And to your point you've been making for a while, so it's very important, I think, to make those distinctions. And it makes me think of too of holding opposing opinions. One of my frameworks for genius is holding opposing opinions in your head at the same time and being able to hold maybe opposing thoughts in your head at the same time. So I think it's important for Bitcoiners to understand that it's not all one direction. There are these dichotomies we kind of have to grapple with and think about, and so it's very important. We talked about the pension disputes earlier. I'd love for you to touch on some of your experience and what you saw with the pensions. I know it's not pensions aren't growing, at least to my knowledge, right? We have a lot of that was the defined benefit, and now we have more of the defined contribution now model, and that's the world we've been living in for the last 40, 50 years since the ERISA Act and all that. So again, a lot of people that watch this show are of that age where they have probably one of those plans, or most all of them probably have those plans. So I'd love for you to just shed some light on kind of what you saw and maybe how Bitcoin might be changing. Obviously, Don Bay, there's pensions kind of around the country that are starting to dip their toes into these waters, whether it's CalPERS or different areas, different smaller sectors. So what are your thoughts on kind of what you've seen and where that world, the legacy retirement world might be headed?
Yeah, well, so I started my career as a lawyer in Detroit, and I was in a litigation group focused primarily on employment and benefits and things like that. And people were fighting. There's always going to be disputes about pay and hours and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But a lot of the workforce in Detroit was unionized. You had the Teamsters and you had the auto workers and things, and they have these huge plans that they're responsible for managing. And when the stock market is ripping great, it's up 10, 12% a year. People don't notice if some bad actors are taking a little bit here and a little bit there. 40 basis points, 50 basis points. They're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's growing for my future. And anytime you've got big chunks of money, big buckets of money like a pension plan, there's going to be temptations for bad actors. And I remember, when the market did start to disintegrate and crash in '08, '09. Now this was a situation where, all of a sudden people, instead of just taking for granted that it's up 10%, 12% a year, now they're looking at every statement. It's like your own, you spend a lot more attention looking at something when things are going down or when things are going badly. And
Yeah.
they started to notice all of these frauds, right? And so it's a challenge. Bitcoin doesn't solve for that problem. That's how I got into the pension space, was litigating frauds or disputes involving who was taking care of the money, breaches of
Mm.
fiduciary duty and things like that, or just flat out criminal behavior. And so I remember, some of these were very large, and some of them were quite small, but they always affected the rank and file worst, right? And that's why, you mentioned Don Bay. I think he's doing a great job for the firefighters out in California and trying to expand that nationally. But when you're looking at a small union like that, there's only a handful of guys, and they're contributing to some larger plan, and they're hoping that the people that they've elected or trusted to look after it are doing a good job for them. And so I think from a pension fiduciary, for somebody managing a pension plan, they have a serious duty to consider looking at Bitcoin as a way to diversify their assets and a way to protect their rank and file, the people that they've been entrusted to look after. Now, more money, if it does well, you can't fight the demographics, right? If you've got too many
Mhm.
people on the plan and not enough people coming in, or if you got too many people retiring and not enough people working, that creates a tremendous amount of pressure. And so Bitcoin in some ways can solve that for the people who are kind of trapped with these low performing assets, whether that's, you know, a stock market or an index or bonds or even real estate to a certain extent, because people forget real estate can go down, right? Or if you make a
Mhm.
bad
Yeah.
play. So opening those things up to Bitcoin can be a great thing. And most pensions need a little slice, right? They don't need to have 100% committed to Bitcoin. I think that would probably be a disservice, but at the same time they need a slice. And or sometimes slice is justified to be a little bigger than 1%. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10, but I think that's really important. But the challenges I was dealing with were fraud cases. I mean, I remember one case I represented this small group. They were maybe 30 dudes, and they had a very niche industry, but they were part of this large multi-state pension plan. And this large multi-state pension plan had been defrauded to the tune of $1 billion+ by some
Jeez.
really bad actors. And some of them went to jail, some of them didn't. And, when the dust settled, the pension was completely underfunded. It's now underfunded by the amount that was stolen. So it's underfunded by $1 billion, and they've only got so many people pouring in. And they sent a letter to every participant, all these small employers around the Pacific Northwest, and said, you guys have to make up the difference. And I remember, the little company I was working for, they had like 30 guys, and they maybe put in, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but say they put in 100 grand in a year toward the pension. They were sent a bill for $1.5 million, 15 years worth of pension contributions, and they're like, we can't afford that. Like, we were putting in $5 a month for each guy or whatever it was, and now you're asking us to cut you a check for $1.5 million. Those are the kind of things that Bitcoin doesn't solve for that, but it does solve for the hey, we're getting 1% return, but we need to grow 5% in order to feed the mouths of the pensioners that have, devoted their entire lives working for us. So I think Bitcoin is, in that sense, kind of can be a saving grace for a lot of these underfunded or poorly funded plans. But the flip side of that is the more money that's in these plans, the more they're going to be, a target for bad actors. And so your vigilance has to go up. And so I think that's going to be a real tension. But I saw plans, large and small, union, non-union, they're all susceptible to the same challenges. And it's like, kind of the classic, who benefits, like where follow the money, who benefits. And the nice thing about Bitcoin is you can make it transparent, right? It's on chain.
Mhm.
So you can publish the results. You can make it transparent. The people know where it is and they can see it. And I that's one of the features about Bitcoin. People call it a bug, but it's a feature that makes it good for pension plans because of its full transparency if it's done the right way. I know there have been criticisms of Saylor and others to say, well, do you really have that much Bitcoin? You say you do, but do you have it? And it's like, well, it would be easy enough to show if you had it. You have control over the wallets, publish the addresses, people could see and have a window into that transparency. That could be a good thing for financial companies. Um, people talk about runs on the bank, there's the old scene from It's a Wonderful Life where Jimmy Stewart's
Mhm.
got the little savings and loan, and they come in and they want their money back, and he says, well, I can't give you the money because it's tied up in your neighbor's loan, and it's tied up in your neighbor's
Yeah.
mortgage, and it's tied out, and that's how banks work, right? They're not fully collateralized. They always keep a couple of percent worth of their balance sheet in cash, and everything else is out, it's being deployed. And Bitcoin companies won't be immune to that, but a Bitcoin bank or a Bitcoin lending facility, if they keep enough collateral, then their depositors, their pensioners, whoever's on the other side of that, should be better protected, especially if you have take advantage of that transparency. But again, at what level, right? If you go and you deal with a company, how much of it are they going to keep? How much of it are they going to deploy? How much of it are they going to roll into another financial product and redeploy and leverage and leverage and leverage again? So again, that's where the fine print comes in, and who are the counterparties that you're dealing with. And I said there's some good ones out there, and you've got to find them and work hard to find them if that's the route you want to go.
There's so many amazing points there, and it makes me think of you are your own pension plan. Whether you have defined benefit or defined contribution, or you have none of those things. A lot of the younger generation is kind of like, hey, this is FUBAR. Like we're off. I mean, probably people under 40, under 35, they're like, I'm not getting any of this. And to a large extent, even the people that are guaranteed something, you might be guaranteed, the whatever's on the agreement of the $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month. What will that buy someone in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years? And so that's the decision. That's the question we're all facing. And it makes me think of, some of the big memes right now are, 0.1 Bitcoin to retire and 0.001 Bitcoin or get to 1 Bitcoin or whatever it is. But I would love for you to unpack, like, what do you, when you look at your kids, like, what are their stacking goals? Like, what are younger people? Because before it was 6.15, the American Huddle mean, the more satirical mean, but truly, like, it gets more expensive. More of these dollars, you need to find the same Sats or the same Bitcoin. So, what are, you have the unique position of being in the Bitcoin world, a legal mind, seeing pensions, but this retirement crisis that we're in, for you, whether it's you yourself or your children, your posterity, how do you look at it? Like, what are you telling them, stacking goals? Like, what are those goals? We were talking about a little bit offline earlier, but like, how do you kind of envision that playing out?
Well, I've seen this done by a lot of people, but they say, "Oh, I gave my kids a $10 allowance," and I said, "You've got to save some portion of it. You've got to give a portion
Mm,
of it to the
yep.
church or give it away to start getting in those habits of giving, and then you can spend the rest, right?" And I
Yep.
think that's the same mentality. Spend less than you make. Always save some. Always give a little away, and if you can start doing that early and try to carry that through even as you scale, as you get a better job, as you get, start your own business, whatever it is. I mean, that kind of financial prudence will go a long way. But there was a science fiction writer that I like. His name's Robert Heinlein, and he said, years and years ago, maybe in the 50s, he said, 1950s, for your younger listeners. I'm talking about the last century, and and he said something like, if you save, so much per day, and get compound interest, then at 100 years from now you'll have X millions of dollars, at which point it will be worth absolutely nothing, right? And he was and that's the challenge, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
you can be frugal and you can save everything, but if it's in the wrong spots, then it's gonna lose value. And so you really have to be guarded. Now Bitcoin, because of its fixed supply, is that's where the sauce is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's because of its fixed supply, it's not going to inflate, it's going to deflate against other fiat currencies. And so that to me is the real magic here, is the fact that because of the fixed supply, in theory it should only go up in value over time, as long as people continue to use it and it remains usable as peer-to-peer currency, peer-to-peer financial transactions. And if we can protect that, then I think we can protect something for our kids, our grandkids, our posterity, for our businesses, for our neighbors, our neighborhoods. Like I was working a little bit with my local church, my priest. He's got a big old church, big old school. They're really inefficient in terms of heating, and so he came to me and we hooked him up with some space heaters. For all the little pockets. They had this giant
Yeah.
boiler system, and you could heat the building, but like there were always these pockets of cold,
Yep.
in Michigan where it's cold. And so by getting little space heaters, he was going to have to pay for the electricity anyway. So then he's now deploying some Bitcoin miners as space heaters. He was going to have to eat the cost anyway. Now he can stack a few sats. Now this isn't at scale, but this is the kind of thing that every church, every hospital, every small business, if you're taking something you're spending anyways, and you can somehow find a way to save in Bitcoin, or conserve in Bitcoin, or have that gives you the ability to be more resilient over the long haul. And so there's no reason why people can't do that in small, circles, small groups, or small communities. And I think there's going to be a trend toward that. There's been this rushing toward nationalism, rushing toward federalism, where everything concentrates at the top, but then the rent seekers at the top are exploiting all the way down. And so if more and more regular folks, more and more grassroots groups and organizations can say, you know what, we're going to take some of those things back, rather than trust a national bank, we're going to do it locally. Why go to a bank and get a loan when you can go to friends or neighbors or your community to do it? And why not do it in Bitcoin as opposed to something unsound like some rapidly inflating currency? We don't see that as much here in the US, because the dollar has been supreme after World War II. But the reality is that it's more and more pressing, more and more places around the globe, and that movie's coming to a theater near you here in the US too, right? It's just, if you want to make the historical argument, that's coming. So so the more and more people can organize along those smaller local communities with people they can trust. I think that allows for something like Bitcoin with its fixed supply to add the most value.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, that's how America was founded, right? It was, decentralized, locale, communities, churches, church communities, and in heck, the states, right? I mean, states were really the top. I mean, they're all separate countries in essence with some, federal overarching structure on top of it. But boy, how far we've fallen, how far we've gotten away from the ideals. And to your point, I mean, scary to a degree, because that's a lot of what we're talking about here today is this world where if you lose that ethos, you can kind of see, I mean, America is a good example of, if you lose your way, you lose your ethos, what happens. And so we're to a degree living in that world, albeit a little bit different, but man, it is pretty wild. Do you, in saying that though, this is so, like, this is the George Gammon argument, in that macro world. I feel like a lot of, like, the Gen X macro guys, I've talked to Dr. Jeff about this many times over the last few years, when he's like, yeah, a lot of Gen X guys, these macro addicts, they just, for whatever reason, they don't understand. It's like when you grow up in the system, being taught the system, but you're never taught what the system is, or the money that it's using. You're starting like on second base or third base, but you're not asking, like, well, why are we here? Why are we playing on a diamond? Like, what is money? And we're just like playing this game, but we don't even know what game we're playing. And so the argument that I like, when George Gammon or Jeff Booth are going back and forth, and hey, we agree on everything, but like, George is someone who doesn't believe that education, education has to change, and this is a lot of what we're talking about too. But do you really believe, because I've been in spaces with George too, and we went back and forth with on a couple different occasions, where it's like, George, you can't, as someone who wants to end the Fed as himself, and really advocates for that, how do you out propagandize the state when they're printing endless amounts of currency? How can we ever out propagandize the government school system that's run by the state? You can't, in my eyes, you can't. So we have to have this system where you're moving to a new monetary system and transitioning to it to give ourselves a fighting chance. Because he's always like, well, in 100 years from now, Bitcoin is great and it might work for a while, but then we're going to be right back where we started, another fourth turning from now, because people have forgotten their ways. Where I'm going with all this is, in your mind, I'd love for you to unpack the alignment of incentives. What Bitcoin does, this, and like you just touched on, this finite fixed supply that is equally finite to all of our time on Earth. How does that, in your mind, does this really change incentives long term? Does it, even when FTX blows up and some of these people really do these ridiculous lending schemes, and it's just paper, and then they blow themselves up, will people really start to change over time, and more humans will start to understand the system and learn and transition to doing things a better way? Not everybody, but some of the people, enough people where we're not dealing with this. We kind of learn from our past mistakes. Like, I would love for you to unpack your thoughts on this and just incentive structures.
Sure, I sure hope so. I mean, there's certainly the risk that these things are happening, whether you participate in them or not, or you opt out or not. You asked about education. So one of the things I did is I've never sent my kids to public school.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a public school in a very rural area. I felt like I got kind of the last generation of decent public
Mm-hmm.
school education.
Yeah.
Growing up in the 80s and 90s. But, to me, my in-laws were educators. They were public school educators, and I wouldn't be caught dead with my kids in a public school right now. And
Yeah.
that's not a choice people can make easily. It requires quite a bit of sacrifice. I'd much rather, in some ways, stack those sats than pay private tuition.
Yep.
But I see a lot of people. There's been a huge trend for private schools, homeschool, other things to opt out, so they don't get indoctrinated the wrong way. Um, that's one example where if you continue to participate in a bad system, you're going to, there are consequences to that. And so my kids, read the old text. They go to a classical school where they, you know, read and study Latin. They look at history and in the original text instead of some modern gloss on it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that gives them a real advantage. It helps them be critical thinkers. But you see that with everything. Higher education. I'm a lawyer, and so for me, I'm the first guy in my family to graduate from college, and then I went on to law school on top of that. And if you wanted to be a lawyer, you had to punch those tickets, and then you had to go sit for a bar exam in every state that you want to practice in, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of a cartel in some ways, and that was part of a system that you had to pay to play, and you had to opt into that system. Is that the right approach for most people? Probably not. I see people going and getting $100,000 in debt for a university degree that is worthless and doesn't make them a critical thinker. Would I recommend that? No, go learn a trade. There are any number of I've got a friend who started a trade school, and he's training these young men and doing it the right way. And these kids are going out, they're learning a trade, they're doing things, they're learning discipline, and they're going out making real money. They don't have a lot of debt, and they instill these work habits and these ethics of showing up and putting out. And to me, those are the kind of things that the more that happens and the faster that happens, the better it is for society, for culture. But you can fix the money by providing an alternative, but if you don't fix the culture along with it, you're going to make the same mistakes. And so that's a real risk. But people who take the time to articulate these concerns, to write about these things, that's a resource then for everybody who follows. So you're contributing in a positive way to maybe getting more and more people, for the scales to fall off their eyes or their eyes to open to what's really going on around them. And all you can do is your part. You can do the best you can, and try to do that with yourself and those around you. What do they, when the airplane's going down, they say, put on your own oxygen mask
Yeah.
first before, and then help those around you. I think it's the same concept. Is you've got to try to navigate the best you can. But you also, the more you learn, the more you're going to see, you know what, I'm not going to keep doing that. I'm not going to do it the same way. And those are like little pockets of resistance, and you don't have to be
Hmm.
out there, swinging guns and viva
Right.
la revolution. You can do so in a quiet way by taking care of yourself, taking care of your family, those around you, and trying to go about it the right way. So I think there's a lot to that. That was one of the reasons why I started Ocean, was with I was working with some of the best minds in the space, Luke Dasher and others, and it was time to kind of put my money where my mouth was. I was, it was one of those things that we wanted to build something. We thought it was important for Bitcoin, to focus on decentralization, to focus on transparency. And so, was I going to do it? Or was I going to hope someone else did it? So it was, part of it was, let's do it together. Let's see what we can do to make a positive impact in a difficult space. So, that was me trying to follow my own. You can talk the talk, right? But you got to
Hmm.
sometimes put your actions and your own actions where your philosophies are. So
And that's a phenomenal segue to talking about Ocean a bit more and what you guys are doing and why this is so incredibly important. First, I would love for you to touch on why. You're an incredibly smart guy, thoughtful person, great background, and could have done many different things. Why Bitcoin and why Ocean? So like what were some of your orange pill moments that you even got you into the space? I mean, you're in the legal world, but then you're seeing this happen. Like some of mine were, just understanding and seeing like the custody of Bitcoin, and you don't really own all your assets. You can store Bitcoin in your head, your wealth, but you can't do. I was a real estate guy, and so it was like, how do you? You're in this world where your assets aren't really yours. The state has a grip on them. Property taxes, they're hitting you with fees, whatever it might be, and you realize I don't. But then Bitcoin comes along, and you're like, whoa, I can custody these in my own head. I'm seeing Metcalfe's law play out. That it's not a linear chart where it's up and down price movements, but it's network effect of log scale. Seeing it's a growth of a network over time. Those are some of the things that really orange pilled me. What were some of those moments for you that put you on that journey?
Well, so I probably wasn't as sophisticated financially. I was just kind of grinding. I was working hard. I tried to find a job that I was good at, that I could make a good salary and provide for my family. But I was always interested in technology. And so I grew up in a very rural area. I grew up in a town with one stoplight. And my dad saw, he saw computers and tech is really important. And so very early on, he really sacrificed, but he got me a Commodore 64, an early personal computer. And I
Mm-hmm.
used it mostly to play video games, but I also learned a little basic programming. And then I took a class at the local college to learn some DOS. And I wish I would have kept up with the programming, right? Because I can't code Python or C plus or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that I always enjoyed tech and always enjoyed learning new things. And so I had been at large firms, like I said, from the early 2000s through the financial crisis, and saw these things caving in all around me. I was already kind of a libertarian. I had some conservative thinking. I went to a very good school for that called Hillsdale College. It's a small Division II school in Michigan, but they're known more for their politics. But they also had like Ludwig von Mises's Austrian economics library at the college, right? And so I was not an economist. I studied other stuff. I studied biology and chemistry, but To me, when you start to get exposed to those ideas of Austrian economics or libertarian thinking, Bitcoin was a real natural segue and real natural fit. So when it popped up on the scene, I had heard whispers of it. Like it was
Mm.
interesting to me. I was teaching or not teaching. I was a lawyer for a law school and down in Florida, and some of the students were talking about it, and they were talking about, oh, I use it to buy video games or whatever. Some were probably using it for more nefarious things, but it was very interesting to me, this idea of technology money or internet money. But then when you looked at it, it had all of these kind of core principles, these philosophical principles of, being censorship resistant and being resilient to corruption, through its encryption and resilient with this private keys, but a public ledger. It was very interesting to me. So I started to hear some whispers about it, but it was very hard for me to get my arms around it. I was working a ton. I was working, 12, 16-hour days. I was busy. I had kids, so it was hard to kind of just take time to slow down long enough to study it. But Florida was good. It had some early conferences. There were some conferences early on, and I went to one of them. This was like 2013, 2014. And you'd go and it was like drinking out of a fire hose. So you hear all these guys talking about it. Everyone had their little booths. And, I go to a meetup now with 250 people, and there's more people at a meetup at some regional thing than there were at those early national conferences,
Wow.
right? And so I got introduced to the space then, and so I said, oh, I got to get some Bitcoin. And so I tried to be a miner early on. I went out and a lot of people have these stories, but I pre-ordered the Butterfly Labs miner, right, and it never came. I've heard rumors that some people got theirs. I've seen them, right? I know they exist, but I was not one that got one. And so then I went out and I tried to get one on eBay, right? I tried to get one secondhand on eBay. That never showed up either. I went through eBay's dispute resolution. I at least got my money back, but it was one of those things that I tried
Wow.
for probably 18 months to get a Bitcoin miner in the early days. And Bitcoin was already on the scene then for 5 years, '09 to, you know, 2013, 2014. It was already around. And I felt like I was coming late to the party. I think a lot of people have that feeling like they're always coming
Hmm.
late, but the reality is that you're not too late. This is supposed to be generational money for hundreds of years into the future. So it's better late than never. Like just get in, right? Just get in. And I remember I eventually got my first Bitcoin from a gambling website. This was one of the few
Wow.
things I'm trying to remember the name of it, but I was able to buy like 5 Bitcoin on some gambling website, and it's actually a moment of a bit of embarrassment, but I paid for my science books in college by playing online blackjack, online gambling.
Mm.
And I was never fast enough or smart enough to be able to go into an actual casino and do it in real time. But in the early days, this was back with like dial-up modems. Like in the early days, you could go to an online gambling website, and if you put up $100, they would match it $100. Like those kind of deals are
Wow.
gone. But in the early days, they'd give you a pretty good head start. So even my slow mind could, play the odds, and over time, with 100% head start, I could make enough for my books. And I studied biology and chemistry, and so the books were like this thick. They were really expensive, like and so I would get enough money for my books, cash out, and then go to school for the semester, and then I'd do it again. And then they outlawed online gambling in the U.S. like in the late '90s, and so then I had to quit doing that. And then scroll forward a few more years, it came back again. It was legal again, and so I paid for my law school books using online gambling.
Wow.
I would get enough for my books, my legal textbooks. You can see some of them on the shelf back there, and
Wow.
then as soon as I would get enough, I would cash out, and I would always quit while I was ahead. And then so when Bitcoin came around, I was like, wait, you mean there's online websites, you put up, send them your credit card or whatever, or you get the Bitcoin. And so I figured I'd just get enough and then cash out, and I'd have my first Bitcoin. And it's the only time I've ever lost playing online blackjack, and I lost it all. My first 5 Bitcoin came and went. I was completely embarrassed. I was completely ashamed of myself, and that's how I lost my first Bitcoin. So then I was back to zero. So then I had to get off zero again. I didn't have my miner. I failed
Wow.
the mining route. I failed the online gambling route. I had to start over again. And by then, you started to have exchanges. Coinbase had popped up in 2014, I think. 2015, you could get some. So then I started to stack a little bit. I stayed in the space. And if you hang around long enough, I was one of the few lawyers that I would run into, and people would have questions, and Bitcoiners would stick around, and so I got reached out to by a random guy on Twitter, back in the day, and he said, "Hey, you're a lawyer," and I think I held myself out on Twitter as like Catholic husband, father of five, Bitcoiner or something, and he reached
Hmm.
out with a legal question, and I tried to give him the Bitcoin community is always very helpful to people, and they tend to be, other than the people who are fraudsters, the rest tend to be very opening,
Yep.
welcoming, and try to help people. And he reached out on a question. I gave him a straight answer, and we've been friends ever since. And that random stranger on Twitter was Luke Dasher, and
Wow.
Luke happens to be the longest serving Bitcoin core maintainer. He's got one of the most electric minds in the space. He's been in the game forever. He's probably one of the, if you make a list of the top 10 Bitcoin programmers in the world, he's certainly on the list. He might even be the top guy. And he's been a friend and a client for a long time now, over 10 years. And so, so that was how I got into Bitcoin. And then you meet other Bitcoiners and they have trouble and they have this and they have that, and you help people through some of these challenges. And so I've stayed in the space, and finally, I was sitting around with Luke, a friend, a client, and he was complaining, this a couple years ago now, and he was complaining about centralization. And and centralization is a complicated topic, but it's nation state centralization, mining hardware centralization, geographic centralization. It's a really tough topic. It's really complicated, and he was complaining about it and seeing some real threats. And this is somebody that wants Bitcoin to be successful. He's devoted, much of his adult life and his professional career to it, and he wants it to succeed. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And he kind of shrugs and looks at me and he says, I don't know. What are you going to do about it? And so we're kind of looking at each other like a couple of dorks, and we're like, well, what are we going to do about it? So
Spider-Man meme.
yeah,
Yeah.
Ocean was our effort to try and do something about it. And, Luke had run one of the earliest pools, and just as a hobby with another guy named WizKid. And they just they had about 20 or 30% of the world's global hash rate running through WizKid's basement back in the day. And no website,
Nice.
no anything, no forward facing, no UX. It was just, mine to this, Stratum port, and the Bitcoin showed up in their address. And it was brilliant in its simplicity, but it wasn't a real business, right? And so, part of this was, we had to put a team together. And Mark Artimko, the other co-founder, is an energy guy. His background is energy, super smart guy, hardworking, other Catholic gentleman. And so, when you're trying to do something hard, you've got to find people you can trust. And so, Luke, Mark, and I said, "All right, this is going to be it." So the three of us started Ocean. We tried to put the band back together again. We got WizKid back on the team. I think our first hire was Bitcoin Mechanic, one of the best decisions we've made. And we've been out trying to do what we can on decentralization as it relates to Bitcoin mining pools in particular, right? We knew we couldn't do anything on the hardware side. We knew we couldn't do anything geographically. We're not running the mining operations ourselves, but we thought we could do something on the software side. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been live for about 18 months now, and we've been growing. And so we're trying to do our part to get Bitcoin back to the basics, those early days where, it used to be you could mine from your laptop, you would run your own node, you would just download Bitcoin, right? And you're
Yeah.
running a node, you're mining transactions, and those days are kind of, in a sense, long behind us, right? We've had specialized mining hardware since the ASICs first started to roll out in 12 or 13. And it's completely changed the industry. Now it's a big play between, can you find cheap energy and fast machines, and it's always done at scale, it seems to be. And so, this was something that we said, well, we can still help pools, get rid of some of those intermediary risks, right? Disintermediate. We talked earlier about, counterparty risk and trusting people if it's a loan or something like that. Well, Bitcoin is designed to be peer-to-peer financial transactions, but all the large pools were taking custody of all the newly minted Bitcoin. They were taking custody of all the Bitcoin, and they were saying, hey, don't worry, we'll pay you a fair shake. We'll pay you a fair split, FPPS they call it, full pay per share. But, we saw evidence of skimming and shaving, and There's no such thing as a free lunch. And so when you say, all right, you're taking custody of everything, there's a cost to that money. They were paying people every day, no matter what. They're paying people every day based on their proof of work, whether they hit blocks or not. And that requires from the pool side, not only custody of the Bitcoin, but a deep treasury, because the network is designed to fluctuate, right? You're all
Mm-hmm.
running the same algorithm. You're all trying to mine the same transactions. And on average, they hit every 10 minutes, a new block is found. But the reality is that you might go through periods of high luck where you hit more than you expect, and you go through periods of low luck where you hit fewer than you expect. That's called variance. And so these large pools were taking custody of everybody's Bitcoin. They were absorbing the variance, but there's a cost to that money. It's like if you go down and want a loan, if you go and you go and get a commercial loan, you might pay 12-15% interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you've got good credit, if the business is a good risk. If you go and you get a mortgage, you might get 7%, 7.5%. But if you go down to the corner store, that little payday loan place, you're going to pay whatever that usury rate is. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
28% in this state, it's 35% in that state. It's the highest possible interest rate. And that's what we were seeing in the FPPS space. You were paying for the cost of that money, that short-term loan, whether you knew it or not. And then people were paying fees on top of that. So, the pool fee. And so, by the time it got to their pocketbook, they weren't seeing as much Bitcoin as what they were doing the work for. And so we thought if we could disintermediate, be a completely non-custodial solution in which people, like in the early days, the miners do the work, we help them talk to the network pays them directly. And that's been a great solution for us. For the miners that use us, they get more revenue. They do give up that variance risk, right? They have to absorb that variance themselves. They don't get paid unless we hit blocks, but they're getting more revenue. So instead of trading cash flow or that security that comes with it, which is really kind of a false security, they get more revenue when they mine with Ocean. And if you get more revenue, that makes that really tough business of Bitcoin mining, which is a really hard business, that makes it that much more palatable because you're generating more revenue. So whether you're a small guy doing it for yourself, or you've got investors or others, being able to generate more revenue using a non-custodial solution like Ocean has been a real win for our customers. So we're happy about that. It's a good product. There's other things that we've done around it that I think are also good for the space, encouraging people to run nodes, getting back to the basics there. But at bottom, we provide a service, Bitcoin mining service, a pool, and we help our miners, our customers get more revenue. So we think it's been a real win, and we hope we've been growing, and we hope that we continue to do so as we chart this course into the future, get people back to the basics, and be able to make more money when they do it.
Yeah, it's what you guys are doing is incredible. There's a lot of people that watch the show that probably don't understand half of what you said or more. So I would love for you for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever, to take, take all of that and why is that important, for someone learning Bitcoin, for someone trying to understand, there's 10, 20, 30% of the watch a show that love it. They get it. But for the person that's learning what you guys are doing, why is it important? Decentralizing things and making things harder to attack, and for mining pool centralization, what does that mean to the average person? And why is that so important that the monetary system that they're learning about and they're trying to trust, what are you guys doing for them?
Yeah, so I guess maybe just a quick note, what is Bitcoin mining at all? So Bitcoin mining is processing the transactions. And so if you use a credit card and then you swipe your credit card, Visa or MasterCard is processing those transactions. You've got a
Mm-hmm.
centralized custodial solution that says, you swiped it, we believe it's you, so we're going to pay that vendor or pay that person on your behalf. And they're processing the transactions. It's a walled garden. You use Visa, it only works where Visa is accepted. If
Mm-hmm.
you use Amex, it only works where Amex is accepted. And they've got this network of vendors and users, and they're processing it. And they charge a fee for it, 2%,
Yep.
3%, 4%, it depends, right? And all of that revenue, they just take off the top in exchange for using the service. Well, Bitcoin, part of its beauty is that you didn't need a centralized service like that in order to process the transactions. The way it works is the Bitcoin network publishes, or you post those transactions, and miners around the world running a node and mining Bitcoin will pick up those transactions and process them in a decentralized, censorship-resistant, government-resistant way. And by processing that, they do it for a transaction fee, but the fees historically, and I expect long into the future, are far less than paying some middleman 5% to do it for you. And that's the beauty of a peer-to-peer financial network. And it's completely distributed, completely decentralized. But somebody's got to do it. And the way it's processed is you take a computer, or in this case, an ASIC, a fast computer that's dedicated to processing the transactions. And so that requires a capital commitment. You have to buy the machines that can process the transactions, and you have to plug them in. It's actually a very green space, right? It just uses
Hmm.
electricity. So,
Yeah.
a lot of people are being creative with using hydro and solar and doing all these things to do it. But any type of energy will do, but you've got to pay for the energy and you've got to pay for the machines. And that's really an expensive proposition. And so that's why Bitcoin mining is so hard, right? Because people are always coming up with newer and cheaper ways to get energy, and people are always coming up with faster and faster machines. And so that's why it's a tough space, but that's what Bitcoin mining is. It's a way to process all of the world's transactions without having to trust MasterCard, Bank of America, or whomever who would normally process those.
Hmm.
It's you're instead trusting the entire network to do it and do it the right way. And since everybody's using kind of the shared code, the Bitcoin algorithm, they're all running the same thing. You can trust that that process is working, and so that's why that's Bitcoin mining kind of in a nutshell. And then what a pool is, when you mine Bitcoin, in the early days, people would just do what they call solo mining, and they would just play the lottery. They would spend their money on the electricity. They would spend their money on the machine, and if they hit the blocks, they would get all of the reward. And Bitcoin, as part of its network effect, would give a subsidy, and we're still in a period of subsidy, right? 50 Bitcoin plus whatever transaction fees were related to that. And then every 4 years, they have the halving, in which then that went from 50 to 25 to 12 and a half, and so forth. And now we're at 3 and an eighth or whatever it is. That's the subsidy. That's the Bitcoin network getting out into circulation the 21 million Bitcoin. But then once they're in circulation, there's still an incentive for miners to mine because they get whatever subsidy there is and the transaction fees related to the, 2, 3, or sometimes 4,000 transactions that are
Hmm.
included with every block. And so that's what a Bitcoin miner is doing. But over time, that became harder and harder for an individual miner to find a block, even if you were doing it at scale. And so the only sensible way to deal with that was to pool with other miners. Otherwise, you're lottery mining. And so if you're a lottery miner, you get everything. If you win, you get the whole thing. But if you don't hit, then all of your electricity, all of your capital expenditures on the machines, you get nothing. And so that became too painful for too many, especially as the subsidy went down. And so over time, the tendency to pool was essentially automatic. And so the problem with the pools is those also began to take a bigger and bigger slice. They put more and more layers in between. And that's the part we didn't like. So what we do is we make sure that the proof of work that you do allows you to solo mine. And by solo mine, I mean create your own transactions, decide what goes in, what you're mining. With the other pools, you just point your work for them, you hash, right? You're doing the hash rate, the proof of work, but you actually don't know what's being mined until they tell you. With ours, you solo mine, you choose the template, you construct it yourself, you know what you're mining. And if you hit, or anyone in our network, anyone in our pool hits, then we share the economics. So really what we're doing is a communication split to share, hey, you were 1% of the pool, you'll get 1% of the rewards. You were 10% of the pool, you get 10% of the rewards. So that's how a pool is designed, is to do a fair split of somebody's proportional contribution to the pool. And so by disintermediating and getting some of the middlemen out of in between, that leaves more in the hands of the miners, the ones doing the actual work, the ones spending the money on energy, spending the money on machines, by cutting out as many middle layers as possible and helping them communicate quickly and efficiently to the network. That makes sure that they get the biggest split or the biggest share of the work that they do. Now, we've also got software that allows you to continue to solo mine and lottery mine if you want to roll the dice. But we don't encourage that. We want you to solo mine, make your own templates, be kind of the master of your own transactions, run your own node, but then pool the resources, pool the reward. So that's, we think, the best of both worlds. in a very competitive, difficult environment.
If you're liking this interview, but you're just wondering, hey, you know what, Brandon, this is amazing stuff. And I get you have these guests on and they're talking about how orange pilling the world is so great and how Bitcoin is going to take over the world. How in the world do I educate my family and friends? How do I get people to understand what most people just don't care about, quite honestly? Bitcoin trading cards is the way to do that. When you open up these cards, you see the foil cards, you see the chase, you see the glossy cards, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, it doesn't matter. People love these cards. It's awesome because they're super valuable, by the way. Amazing little side note. However, it Trojan horses them into the most important thing of the day. It's not politics. It's not all the things that we fight about. It's changing the money, fix the world. Bitcoin trading cards is the best way that we have going in order to do that, no matter who you are. You're going to love them. Playable Characters 10 for 10% off at checkout. Playable Characters 10 off at checkout. BTC-TC.com. You're going to absolutely love these things. Now back to the show. I guess that's one thing. Before we start circling the airport here and preparing to land, talking about some price and what you guys are seeing, what you're thinking about this cycle and going forward. I would love for you just to touch on nation states mining, anything you might be your thoughts there, what you're privy to, and just these huge liquidity pools starting to tap into whatever it might be, mining, renewable mining, all the things that you just have kind of alluded to a degree. What are your thoughts with these big players starting to come in and how it might really affect things or change the mining and the network going forward here?
Well, certainly the trend has been the network globally has been growing, right? And you're seeing more and more large scale miners, but you're also seeing more and more nation states dip their toe in. Some are retreating from it. I think there's some famous memes about Germany selling off all their Bitcoin and saying poo poo with that's Shiza or whatever they say, but the reality is that I think that's a mistake. A lot of countries, especially small countries, they may have sources of energy. They may have abandoned energy or stranded energy, large sources of hydro or solar or other things, but their population doesn't necessarily, or their population density doesn't account for it, right? The challenge with energy is that some of the places where it's easiest and best to produce it around the world aren't necessarily where the people live. And energy really needs to have the load or the users close to where the source is. And so you can take somebody who's got a landlocked country up in the mountains somewhere, generate all kinds of hydropower from it. There's not many people that live up there. It's for a few shepherds and goats, but all the cities are down below. It's really expensive to transmit that energy long distances, and it doesn't call for the infrastructure. And so you can stand up Bitcoin mining close to the source of the energy and use that to now create revenue, create profit that you can use to subsidize the rest of your community. And we're seeing that at scale with some countries around the world using very creative things like hydro or geothermal power or other things. And I think it's a great play for their countries. There's been some well-publicized examples of that, and we're trying to do everything we can at Ocean to help those countries do it. Like I said, if they're going to make the commitment to mine Bitcoin, and whether it's the beneficiary of that is some individual miner, or in this case, an entire country's population, we want them to make sure that more of that money gets into their hands than with some of our competitors. And so we're committed to helping those nation states, large or small, mine Bitcoin and do it the most efficient and revenue efficient way. So we're seeing that. It's exciting to me. And I think you're going to see more of it. People talk about game theory and which countries are doing it, which ones are going to win, which ones are going to lose, and it'll be interesting to see that play out in real time. Now, the flip side of that is, there's also large countries like the United States. The prior administration was pretty hostile to Bitcoin. We've been dealing with that now for a long time. The current administration seems to use the word crypto a little more than I'd like. To me, crypto is really kind of code word for not understanding what Bitcoin really is. There's Bitcoin, and this is one thing I would agree with Saylor. There's no second best, right? Everything else to me is a poor imitation or poor imposter, and probably has a scam behind it. I'm just waiting for the rug pull on most of them, right? But the reality is that with big countries, the United States, I've not seen any the government go out and make large purchases of ASICs or machines or deploy a bunch of energy, but it could. It certainly should. I think every country would be wise to be mining some of its own Bitcoin, even at scale, to make sure that its own transactions get processed, right? If you want to make sure that your transactions get processed, then the best way to do it is to mine them yourself. And so I think you're seeing large companies or large countries start to think, well, maybe we should be doing that too. It would make them more resilient to any number of cyber wars or cyber attacks that are going to happen in the future, where somebody might try to stop you from sending money or moving money. And if you can do that yourself with your own transactions, your own mining, it's going to make you much more anti-fragile and make you much more resilient to pressures from the outside world. So I'd love to see the U.S. do it. People are pretty critical, saying, "Well, we don't want, Bitcoin's supposed to be government resistant money, and so we don't want the government to do it." But it's like, yeah, I get it, but I live in the U.S., and so, my thinking on that is, all of these financial revolutions that have happened in the past have brought with them nothing but pain and suffering, right? And it's usually the regular person, the little guy that suffers the most. And so, if my country, if the country I live in, the one that I've chosen to stay in and raise my family in, if that's the last one to fall, or the one that resists those urges as the chaos happens every place else, then so be it. But I do think that there are going to be some winners and losers here, and the more a country can do to keep its Bitcoin with Bitcoin treasuries. You're seeing a lot of states adopt this. I think Texas just signed a bill, so I think there's trends there. But if states do it, if nation states do it, I think generally that's probably a good thing. I think if more and more get into the mining space itself, that's probably a good thing. It can certainly drive up global hash rate, which makes it harder for smaller miners to compete. But again, that's why we're trying to offer a product that allows them to fight fight fair, whether they're large or small. So again, those are some interesting things that are playing out. I'm not sure how it's going to happen in the future, but I certainly think that Ocean will be here to try and help people of goodwill do it the right way and do it as efficiently as possible.
So, as we land the plane here, I want to talk price a little bit. And one of the if humans work off of FOMO on the one end and fear on the other end. That's just how we're built. And so you have the two huge marketing drivers of whether it's war and or my bank account's getting frozen, and the fear side, or it's, hey, prices going up and drawing people in, and then people are hopefully staying for the freedom. And a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 90 minutes. Where do you think, and then on top of that, we have, Max Kaiser, again, the Overton window shifters. We talked about Saylor earlier, talking about 21 million in 21 years, and Max Kaiser saying 800,000 is in play this cycle. We talked about, the importance of stacking Bitcoin, and you don't need much to retire. As we go forward, and younger people, it's don't get unit count bias. So we've kind of touched on all these things. With all that being said, where do you think we're headed this cycle? I know a lot of Bitcoiners are waiting with bated breath of when's this bull run really going to get going? We've had a little bit of bump over the last, 8-9 months or whatever it's been, and up over 100,000, and we're kind of testing things. But where do you see things playing out this cycle as we move forward in the coming months here?
Yeah, I don't like to, if I were better at picking stocks or picking price, I probably never would have gotten into Bitcoin in the first place. I like the kind of set it and forget it mindset that allows you to have. But I try not to watch price all the time, right? I think you can make yourself anxious or nervous by watching it all the time. I know a lot of pensioners that sit there and they look at their 401k account every single day or 10 times a day, and they just make themselves anxious. So I think that's a bad habit to get into. But I do think price is going to continue to go up. I qualify all this by saying one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin, right? And if you start to denominate things in Bitcoin, your purchasing power goes up. It took 100 Bitcoin to buy a house 10 years ago, and now you can do it with 5, right, or whatever. Yeah. But it's the kind of thing that that I'm fearful to make too close of a prediction. But I think by the end of the year, it would not be surprising to me if we were in that 140 to 160 range, at least 150. I think that makes a lot of sense. These aggressive predictions of saying by the end of the cycle, I think most folks are thinking really the 4-year cycle until the next halving. But if you're thinking by the end of the cycle that it could double or triple again, that's really not unheard of. If you look at historically, jumping pretty aggressively, I think the average is about 150, 160% a year on average for the last 10 years, other than those first couple of years with the 1,000% run-ups. Right. So I think this idea that there will be $1 million Bitcoin, I tend to agree with that. I just can't tell you exactly when, but here we are in the middle of 2025. I think we're probably going to be 150 by the end of the year. I think we're probably going to be 250 to 300 by this time next year. I mean that's a doubling in 18 months. So I think that's what we saw the last 18 months, give or take. We probably saw 3x, 4x over that same time frame. When we launched Ocean, Bitcoin was floating around, 20 to 30. It was pretty cyclical in that range. So, seeing that do something similar over the next 18 months, I think, with the global growth of mining, the increase in transactions. Some people say, well, there's all this ETF money and all this stock money coming in. That's a proxy for buying Bitcoin, but that Bitcoin has to come from somewhere. And basic economics is there will always be a seller if the price goes high enough. When you've got a fixed supply, as more and more money comes into the space, those prices are going to have to pop in order to get holders or hodlers to part with their Bitcoin. And there will always be people that, for whatever personal reasons or company dynamics they might be dealing with, are gonna sell some of their Bitcoin if the price is right. So I think the price is going to continue to rip a little bit. You'll still see the volatility. Volatility is getting a little bit smaller. That just shows it's the asset's maturing, right? Gold is kind of the oldest known asset, and it remains relatively volatile. And so when you're looking at commodities and other things, Bitcoin is kind of the modern commodity, and I think it's going to continue to rip. So I would say 150 by the end of the year, and I'd say probably 300 by the end of next year. So that's probably about as far as I can take it on price. But supply and demand. The supply is trickling out. We've got about 1 million to go. 20 million are out there, and we've got about 1 million left to be mined. And people are going to find ways to buy more Bitcoin. And there will always be a seller at the right price. So I think you're going to continue to see that over the next 12, 18 months and long into the future.
Do you think that the I guess we'll call it the TAM, or the total addressable market? Do you think that it is more along the lines of, like, is it one half, is Bitcoin one half of every transaction in the world? There's 900 trillion in global assets. I know Jack Mallers talks a lot about it being, a $450 trillion asset class. It's money's one half of every transaction. Jeff Booth talks about it being all 900 trillion, in essence of, like, hey, it has to account, if we're accounting for all the assets in the world at $900 trillion, then we have to account for all of it. So Bitcoin accounts for every single one of those dollars. And you talk to like a Peter Dunworth, and he's beyond that. And he has his magnifiers, amplifiers, and all these things. And then there's a lot of people that are under those, and they're, somewhere, way under that or whatever. It's, hey, it's, Hal Finney said it's going to be zero. It's going to be 10 million per coin, which puts us at, 210 trillion. So maybe that's maybe half of what Jack Mahler says. Right. So where do you stand on that total addressable market, and like where is this all headed? Because like you said, in the short term it's very tough, but that's not really what's that important. It's important to say, hey, I'm saving in money, all my time and energy that's finite here on earth. Hey, I have this perfect asset to trade for that finite time and energy. It's a finite money, which humans have never had. I mean, that in and of itself should be shocking to the average person, just hearing that and understanding that. So that being said, stack, every single day. What do you think the end goal is? We know directionally it's going this direction. What do you think that end goal is on that spectrum?
Well, it'll be interesting. When you start talking total addressable markets, it's like total addressable market in what, right? And so 900
Mm-hmm.
trillion is like in US dollars, right? They're estimates. Yeah. And so I think that stuff will change over time. I think you're going to see a trend move more and more as people find better ways of harnessing the sun, right? Like you're talking about energy. Energy is kind of a proxy for growth. So economies that are growing have more babies and they have more energy, right?
Yep.
And I might not agree with Elon Musk's lifestyle, but with 14 kids by 6 different women or whatever the number is, right? But the reality is that he's focused on energy and he's focused on population, and you will see some real losers here. Those countries that are dying out, that aren't even having enough babies to do their replacement value and things like that. You're going to see huge demographic shifts around the world, and And with that, you're going to see huge demographic shifts in assets as well. What's valuable today probably won't be that valuable in the future, but vice versa. There are things that are yet to be discovered that that will probably be more valuable than we can contemplate. Whether that's rare earth metals or new things that are used to generate more energy and more people. So it'll be interesting to see as the nature of assets change over time as innovation occurs. But so I'm not really fixed on kind of this total addressable market. Is that going to continue to get inflated if it's valued in fiat dollars? Well, there's only so many people in the world, and there's only so many resources in the world. But our picture of those is going to change pretty substantially. So I tend to think more that Bitcoin will take up a bigger and bigger slice of the world's resources, but you also have to look at adoption. Adoption is still very, very low. And so, so to me, when people start looking at, Bitcoin is the size of, and then they rank the largest companies in the world and they say, oh, Bitcoin's 1 trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, and they start to leapfrog and they start to grow. That's by relative standards, right? But if you really think of Bitcoin, pull back and say, right, this is a proxy for time and energy and money, then I think it's going to approach probably 50% over the next 10 to 15 years. That's fast. I think most
Yeah.
people take a slower glide path there. And I actually think there's going to be, I'm more of a apocalypse type guy. Like I think there's going to be some countries, big countries that fail. I think there's going to be some, we've gone, this is the longest time we've
Same.
gone without, world wars in human history.
Mhm.
And so at least recorded history. So I think
Yep.
things are going to accelerate in spots, and that's going to cause just a real upheaval. And when the dust settles on that, I think Bitcoin will be a bigger slice of the pie than it is today. So that probably gets us, maybe 20 years, but 15 to 20 years, I think Bitcoin will be 50% of the world's total addressable market. What that's denominated in? It may not be the US dollar, and,
Yes.
so I think that's really, but again, this is just me speculating. But I do think that over time, Bitcoin will start. There will be countries that adopt Bitcoin as their legal tender. We're already seeing inklings of that, and so I think you'll see it become more and more more and more common to denominate things in Bitcoin for the purpose of money. And the U.S. may be the last to do it, but if it keeps screwing around, then maybe one of the first to do it. Who knows? But it's gonna start happening and start happening pretty quickly. And I don't see it being some other asset. I don't see it being some other digital money. I think it's Bitcoin, and I think it's here to stay.
Incredible. I don't think there's really much of anything I've disagreed with you with today. We're of similar mind. The last thing I have is a Bitcoin bill here in America. I feel like a lot of what's going on, that people are talking about the current administration, and I know I just saw an article of like hedge fund guys, but just a bunch of different people in the financial world were worried about Bitcoin in the sense of price, albeit probably most likely because that's their industry of when Trump's gone. And the same thing in El Salvador with Bukele. I'm sure a lot of people are like, well, that's great, but what happens when this guy is gone? So in saying all of that, a Bitcoin bill, again, we talked a lot about the countries, mining, all these things are going on. And a lot of people I've talked to Samson Mao a couple months ago. And it seems like a lot of the sentiment is once America kind of has their hands around a bill and figuring out what they're doing, then a lot of other people are going to come on and like, okay, now they figured it out. Like now we can kind of all do what we need to do now in a sense. So it feels like a lot of people are waiting. What would you like to see in a bill? Protecting self-custody, things to do with mining, a de minimis exemption of capital gains, maybe repealing all the capital gains, legal tender. Like what would you want to see in a bill and codifying things?
Yeah, so I'm looking for something to disagree with you on, and so maybe this is it. So, my experience has been, pretty much everything that the government touches, it ruins. And so
Same.
passing a bill that says I have the right to self custody, well, I'm going to go so far as to say I have a natural right or a human right to do that, whether they
Mhm.
pass a law that says that or not. And so in law school, we learned there are layers of laws, right? There's divine laws or universal laws. There's
Mm-hmm.
natural laws. Then there's like man-made laws, right? And then
Yep.
beyond that, then there's like, customs or codes or different things. And so, you know, I like a government of limited government. And I thought the United States did really well with the common law tradition, which tended to move very slowly over time, and it worked things out with legal precedent and through the adversarial process, it created a much finer point. This trend toward codifying everything, this trend toward having a statute for everything has added to complexity, but it's also added to the obfuscation, which creates little pockets for corruption and different things. So while in the short term, I think Senator Lummis is noble for her trying to push something that says, Bitcoin under $600 can be exempt from capital gains tax or something like that. You're just tinkering at the margins. The reality
Mm-hmm.
is that people need to rely less and less on codes and statutes and more on the common law and customs and traditions. I think if they really want to escape from a dangerous a trend toward federalizing everything and making everything a federal crime if you do this or do that. So I'm not looking for a government solution. I'm looking for things that are long lasting and resilient, regardless of who's in power during the current administration. Congress tends to move pretty slowly. People think it's
Mm-hmm.
a bad feature of Congress. It's actually one
Yeah.
of its better features. The less they do,
Yep.
people think that's a criticism. To me, that's usually the better off the country is. Um, and it requires compromise. So I think those things will come and go. Those seasons will change. But if people are looking for the government to make it easy for them, I think they're looking in the wrong place. They need to, like I said, to start our conversation, we talked about taking responsibility and getting down to brass
Mm-hmm.
tacks. And I think that would be better in the long run. So while I generally don't want to deal with mischief, and I certainly, would never encourage somebody to do something illegal. Um, you know, um, at some point you have to say, what, the government's not the solution. Taking personal responsibility is the solution, and building a culture around you that will let you navigate regardless of what a particular state or a particular federal government might do.
Beautifully said. Hi.
Well, I don't know.
uh,
I don't know. That's,
I
like I said,
no, that's
I have pretty strong opinions, but usually,
I love it.
usually when a bill gets suggested, there's a lot of lobbyists behind it, and while there's starting to be Bitcoin lobbyists for the first time, with this new asset class, the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that I don't have a pretty very high opinion of lobbyists or governments, and so usually the corruption follows. So I want them to do less and let individuals do more, but we'll see. Time will tell.
So well said. This is the fight of our time. Is it, the ethos, the Bitcoiner ethos, like I said, sound money, principles, first principle thinking, libertarianism. Is this going to be the way? Can we educate enough people, or is it going to be top down collectivist thinking and central control of things? So yeah, what a wild world. Any last thoughts? Where can people find you, and any last words of wisdom, advice, thoughts?
Well, people can find me. I am a lawyer licensed in 3 states. So, my information's out there. Our company is ocean.xyz. Gives you a little information about what we're trying to do on the transparency and decentralization side. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. My handle is ocean_lawyer on Twitter and or X, I should say. And yeah, I'm out there. Happy to connect. I'm happy to help other people in the space. And I'm not really available for legal work these days. I'm so busy with Ocean, but I do know a lot of folks in the industry. And if you need a referral, let me know, and I can try and put you in touch with the right people.
Mr. Ian Northon, thank you so much for being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much for your time. A lot of fun.
If you can't get enough of these interviews and you want to deepen your education on sound money, wealth building, and freedom, you're not going to want to miss this playlist here. Happy binging. Check it out now. We'll see you inside.